Why do so many Christians fervently support the nation of Israel, the Zionist state of Israel? Why is it that no matter what Israel ever does, they say we will blindly support them? I'm going to be covering this in this video, and I need you to stick with me to the end because I have a lot of good information. We're going to be looking at a little bit at this book, Against Our Better Judgment, which is a very well-documented book explaining how that Zionism came to America, Christian Zionism, and how that the support of the Zionist state became so prevalent to where America spends $3 billion a year, plus every several years we give 14, 15, or more billion dollars away. I'm going to also be looking in the Bible, the Word of God. We're going to be looking at why so many Christians support Israel. And when I say Israel, I'm not talking about the Israel of God. I'm not talking about the Old Testament Israel before their destruction in the first century. I'm talking about this reinstituted Israel we have today, which basically has very little to do with the Bible. All right, first of all, why is there such a zeal? In the first century when Jesus came to this earth, he and John the Baptist, Apostle Paul, none of them came in teaching Christian Zionism as we know it today. None of them were waving a flag saying, if you curse Israel, God will curse you. None of them said that the temple will be destroyed and then 2,000 years later it's going to be rebuilt. None of them taught any of this Christian Zionism as we know it. But during that first century time, there was a changeover from the Old Covenant system, the temple system in Jerusalem, to the church age, and I would also argue the kingdom age as we know it today in Christianity and Christendom. So during this transition period in the first century, there were those that were coming from the temple and were saying to the Apostle Paul, and were trying to turn the early church away from Christ, away from church, back to Old Covenant Judaism, and they were resisting the idea that Jesus had prophesied, and correctly so, that the temple would be destroyed, Jerusalem would be destroyed, Old Covenant Israel would be cast out, the bondwoman, as it says in Galatians, would be cast out, and they were in AD 70, and the church preserved. Now, Zionists don't like that today. They call it replacement theology. However, they have a strong connection to the Sadducees, Pharisees, and scribes in the first century, who were trying to keep all of the emphasis on the old covenant system instead of joining Christ and moving to the new system. So first of all, we're going to take a look at affections. Ask the question, why do so many Christians support Israel with such a zeal? Now, when I say zeal, I'm talking about a few years ago we saw when Kim Jong-un's father passed away in Korea. And we watched as those people wept and cried, and no one wanted to be shown with a happy face. Every face had to show a sadness, despair, and emotion and zeal, or else they feared that they would be in serious trouble. Zionism does the exact same thing. Whenever someone puts a I love Israel post on the internet, just look at all the comments. You see all kinds of hearts, and everyone goes into all caps and I love Israel, I love Israel, I love Israel, I love Israel, over and over, 100, 200, 300, 400, 1,000 posts, 2,000 posts, and everyone's I love Israel. Anyone says, wait a minute, I don't like what Israel's doing in this area or that area, they are cut out, they are chewed to pieces, they are told they're dying and going to hell. I argue that Christian Zionism has reached a point to where it's almost cult-like in its affections that the people feel towards it. It's almost cult-like. That's all I can say. And we're going to look at this. We go first of all to Galatians chapter 4 and verse 17. The Apostle Paul is speaking in Galatians chapter 4. The Judaizers had come into the church, and 4:17 says, they zealously affect you. They, being the unbelieving Jews, we would today call them Zionists, those who want to build the earthly temple system without Christ. They zealously affect you. That word affect means to have feelings, emotions, warmth, joy, hugging. They zealously affect you. We could interpret that as they work really, really hard day and night to get you to have affections for them and their system, but not well. He's saying this zeal you have does not produce anything, and I'll cover that in a minute. Yea, they would exclude you. They're going to kick you out. This is the cult-like mentality. They would exclude you that ye might affect them. In other words, what he's saying here is they're going to kick you out of the churches. They're going to kick you out of their fellowship. You can lose your job. And even today, in some countries like Germany and others, if you don't don't talk about the zeal for the Zionist organizations, if you disagree with the Holocaust or any part of it, you could be excluded and you could go to jail. So they will exclude you that you might affect them. In other words, they kick you out of society so that you will feel ashamed and you will come back and say, oh, my heart goes out to these poor people. My affections goes out to them. But then he says again in verse 4:18, but it is good to be zealously affected always in a good thing, and not only when I am present with you. So, verse 17 says they zealously affect you, but not well. And when kids go to the public schools, they have a lot of teaching on the Holocaust and the different problems that the Jewish people faced down through the ages, and they begin at an early age in all of Western civilization. The movies, the television shows are continuously getting people's emotions worked up for the unbelieving Jews down through the ages. Now, they did this even before the Holocaust, down through history in many nations. According to history books, the unbelieving Jews despised the idea of Christians having passion shows, and so the Jews would try to stop a lot of that, but they would get their theaters and they would continuously remind the Gentiles of what a poor people they were and all they went through and all their troubles and struggles. And so we have movies like Fiddler on the Roof. Again, even before the Holocaust, they had been capitalizing on turning the affections of the Gentiles on them. I mean, they've made a lot of money over it. Even the last few years, we could look at the Passion of the Christ. Mel Gibson made the Passion of the Christ, though. There's the idea of the Passion of the Christ. We had Rahm Emanuel, who worked with Barack Obama's presidency. His brother, I believe Ari Emanuel, was one of the top men in Hollywood. He started fighting against the Passion of the Christ because they don't want the affections of the Christians to be on Christ and his passion and his suffering. They want the affections to be on them and their suffering. Therefore, they can turn the minds and the hearts off of Christ and off of the church and onto themselves. And so that we saw going on in Hollywood just not too long ago. Now, again, we go back to Galatians 4:17. They zealously affect you. They work hard to gain your affections. But it's not for good. Now let's look at this not for good for a minute. So the Christians spend billions of dollars, and America spends billions of dollars, and people write articles, and they spend so much of their time talking about Israel, and pastors, I'm going to say it, waste so much of their time preaching about this secular nation of Israel, secular religious nation of Israel based on Zionism in the Middle East, because everyone's affections have been affected towards that, and I'm going to say this, away from Christ and his church. And so sermons where pastors used to get up and they would preach about Jesus Christ and how he died on the cross and shed his blood and how we need to love our neighbor and love everyone around us has been replaced by sermons where we say, you ought to bless Israel, we ought to bless those Jews down in the Middle East. Now, they zealously affect you, but not well. So what have we gotten out of that? For 75 years now, we have paid billions and billions and billions of dollars, and what do we get out of it? I would argue we don't get a whole lot back out of it. When I was young, I accepted Christ as my Savior at a young age. It wasn't someone from Israel who came and gave me the gospel story. I heard it in my church from my pastor. I accepted Christ as my Savior and put my faith and trust in Jesus Christ as a young man inside of my local church. It was one of the happiest days of my life. I went on from there and I met my wife in our little country church that I pastor right now. I met her many years ago, back in the 1980s. I courted her there in that church. We sat together and we studied our Bible together. We sat in that church many times and talked about our plans for our future and how we wanted to serve the Lord in our community. I was married in that church, and people reached out and loved me in that church. Israel didn't do anything for me. Israel didn't lead anybody to Christ. Nobody in Israel has been reaching the nations for the Lord. The church has been reaching the nations for the Lord. The church has been doing so much good. Israel has not done any good whatsoever for any of us. A lot of people argue, well, but they have this arms manufacturing over there in Israel. Well, they're the military-industrial complex. I understand that. But really, what good has that done for our families, for our homes, for our communities? Our communities are suffering financially because we are pouring so much money into so many of these foreign nations, including Israel. Israel has spied on us. Israel has shot the USS Liberty. Israel has done a lot of terrorism all over the world. What have they done for us? Paul was saying here, what good is your zeal for those people instead of for Christ and the church? In this book, Against Our Better Judgment, tremendous book, it brings out the fact that they work on the zeal, the Zionists worked on the zeal of the Christians. They worked on the affections of the Christians in the 1930s and 40s. And so the vast majority of Americans were not tremendously interested in establishing the nation of Israel, and these people worked day and night, and they used affections. And so the Zionists manufactured Christian support. The American Zionist Emergency Council, the AZAC, worked to form a Christian coalition. Secret Zionist funds eventually reached $150,000 in 1946, and they were used to revive an elitist Protestant group, the American Palestine Committee, formed in 1932. So we see that the American Palestine Committee was the first Christian Zionist organization, and it was formed by people who denied Jesus Christ was the Son of God. They denied that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin. People that openly taught that Jesus Christ was the result of Mary having an affair with a Roman soldier and that she was a prostitute. These were the people who masterminded and founded the modern Christian Zionist, and I'm going to say it, cult. I believe it's a cult. All of these cults that we've heard of over the years, the Jim Jones and all of that, they have one thing in common. I've always said this. They all denigrate Jesus Christ. All cults. Because Jesus Christ is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He sits on the right hand of the Heavenly Father. Satan hates the idea of Christ. And because he is the Logos, he is the organizer, he is the one who creates and sustains marriage, society, all of this as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so all cults despise Jesus Christ because of his leadership. The cult of Christian Zionism, though they don't require the Christians deny Jesus Christ, the founders of it deny Jesus Christ. And now all other cults also demand that you have a fervent, zealous love for them, even over your mother, your father, your family, your church. And Zionism demands the same affections. They demand that everyone love them, or they say you're going to burn in hell and they'll cast you out if you don't have great affections for them. I am going to make an argument that I believe that Zionism, Christian Zionism, is a religious cult. It does deny Jesus Christ. So we see that the AZEC, the American Zionist Emergency Council, in the 1930s and 40s, formed the American Palestine Committee, and this group had originally been founded in 1932. Silver's headquarters issued a directive saying in every community an American Christian Palestine Committee must be immediately organized. And so this Christian Zionist organization, starting in the 30s and 40s, their goal was to build a building in every city in America and every town in America that was going to be the building where they promoted for that city and that community in that area Christian Zionism. They later found out that would be a waste of money. Instead, as they said in their own words, they turned the churches into their committee buildings. The church didn't have to pay a dime. The churches paid for it all. The churches became the promoters and the maintainers of this Christian Zionism, or this Zionism, in every city in the country. So they living and learning, they learned that the churches would do it all for them. And today many churches have become centers not of the preaching of the gospel of Christ, not of the spreading of the kingdom of God. They have become centers of this Christless cult of Zionism. It says they wrote advertisements on clergy's behalf without asking permission of the pastors, is how they got started. And they said many pastors would not fight them for this or take them to court. But they formed another group of clergymen, a second group called Christian Council on Palestine. And so they stated the aim of both of these was, now listen to this, I'm reading in quotes. The memo stated that the aim of both of these groups was to, and I quote, crystallize the sympathy of Christian America for our cause. All right. We're going right back to Galatians 4:17. They zealously affect you, but not well. Yea, they would exclude you, that ye might affect them. Here we go. Right here in modern times, against our better judgment, we have the memo that was written from the AZEC, which was the secular group of Zionist, American Zionist Emergency Council. They created two Christian Zionist organizations. They said, we've created them for this, and let me read it again, to crystallize the sympathy of Christian Americans for our cause, to zealously affect the Christians. But let me ask you something. Was and is that affected for the good Christians? How many people have been saved because of the nation of Israel? How many people have gotten a good husband and wife and been married and established communities and marriages and salvation and souls been saved because of Israel? Zero. It is not for the good. All we have gotten for 75 years is just death and misery and destruction and wars all through the Middle East and turmoil and people losing their families and their homes and all of this for something that is gone, something that is in the past. And so they said, we're going to work on the Christians' affections. Galatians 4:17 fits right along with what's going on even today. The group state, historian Richard Stevens explains that Christian support was largely gained by exploiting their wish to help people in need. Stephen writes that Zionists would proclaim the tragic plight of refugees, fleeing from the persecution and finding no home, thus linking the refugee problem with Palestine as allegedly the only solution. Stephen writes that the reason for this tragedy was clear. While many Americans may not support the creation of a Jewish state, traditional American humanitarianism could be exploited in favor of the Zionist cause through the refugee problem. So now they got all these, they had 4,500 refugees from the Holocaust, from the labor camps in Germany. They took a lot of them and put them on the ship called the Exodus, packed it out with them, and they began to head to Palestine, which was British mandate at that time. They began to head there, but they didn't have the paperwork, they didn't have anything ready. Palestine was not ready at that time to accept them, and the head of what was soon to become Israel was a man by the name of Ben-Gurion. He took charge of the new forming state of Israel, and he's an interesting case. He was one of the first presidents, prime ministers of Israel, but he was instrumental in keeping them on that ship for up to 7 months in very bad sanitary conditions. He was the one who, even though a lot of people on that ship had relatives in America, these Jews on that ship, Many of them were not even Zionists. Many of them didn't even want to go to Israel. Many of them had applied for passports. Many of them had received passports where they could go to America and live with well-to-do family, relatives, New York, different places. They were looking forward to that. And Ben Gurion said no. That ship will not go to America, nor will it go to Europe. Ben Gurion and Israel, the Zionists, were the ones who held that ship out in the water. I've heard all of my life. Oh, the nations that turned down those refugees that came from Germany concentration camps. Oh, they said the European nations and American, how a lot of God put a curse on so many nations, especially England, because they wouldn't let those people go over into Palestine. And a lot of the people on the ship didn't even want to go. But that's not the problem. The problem was Ben Gurion. So they put all of these refugees from the camps of Germany in a ship, and they called that ship the Exodus. And then they paraded them, they floated them around everywhere, saying that America wouldn't accept them, England wouldn't let them get off in Palestine, Europe, nobody wanted these poor people. They sent out pamphlets, particularly to the churches. Christians were just upset. Christians were crying and weeping. They gained their affections by hurting their own people. So we see there that Kimmerling wrote 9 books about that Exodus boat and the plight of the Jewish refugees in Europe. He said that Ben Gurion needed this to dramatize the situation in order to attract more sympathy for Jewish struggles over Palestine. So here we're playing on people's sympathy. This is where they get all their money. This is where they get all their support, is that they play on the sympathies of people and they get a lot of money and they continuously whine all the time. They're the only people in the world that have ever suffered. They're the only people that have ever gone through a hard time. Let me stop right here and just get off on a rabbit trail for a minute. My mother's mother lost 3 sons during the time of World War II. Several of them were died in the war. One of them died there over in Europe, I believe on the Autobahn. She had a nervous breakdown. In the 1930s and 40s, they had just gotten through the Depression, and then they lost 3 sons while deployed in the military. And one son was in a tank. The tank was hit, and he died. The other one, I'm not sure. The third one, while he was on duty, he was driving and had an automobile accident. But he was serving his country. Everybody suffered in World War II. Everybody had losses. And yet there's only one group of people who said, oh, it all ought to be all us. It's all only about us. Had Japanese internment camps in America. We had internment camps all around the world, and people were dying by the hundreds of thousands in that war. There were a lot of people that suffered then, but one group of people has, to this day, capitalized on that. And the Zionists worked to use that. Now we look here, and it says here that Ben Gurion had kept them on that ship to garner more sympathy for the cause of Zionism and to gain, of course, more money. While many people have heard that the British authorities refused to allow their illegal immigration into Palestine and forced the boat to return to Germany, few know that the French government had agreed to host the refugees. But Ben Gurion, who was the Zionist head of Israel, rejected this solution, and the survivors were forced unnecessarily to remain on board for 7 months. Kimberly commented that Ben Gurion's strategy in the Exodus ship affair paid off tremendously. The fate of the refugee ship attracted considerable and sympathetic attention all around the world and served the Zionist cause well. Few observers at the time knew that many of the refugees from the Exodus had applied for immigration visas to the United States and were hardly anxious to settle in Israel. Kimberly points out that by dramatizing the fate of the survivors, in whom he had little interest except as future residents of the state of Israel that he was building, Ben Gurion helped to make Israel the world's chief power broker over Jewish affairs. Under his leadership, Israel established a claim to represent all of world Jewry, and on this basis successfully claimed reparations from the Federal Republic of Germany. And that's another fallacy, is that they say, if you don't support Israel, you hate Jews all over the world. And so Ben-Gurion was the first one to bring that false idea. There are a lot of Jews that do not support Zionism. There are a lot of Jews that do not support Israel today, especially Jews who had been in Iran. But so he purposely tormented Ben-Gurion, the head of Israel, purposely tormented Jewish people, left them for 7 months with no sanitation, very little water, very little food. They were left in horrible conditions, and he did that to parade it before the whole world, to particularly get the Christians on his side, to say, oh, the nations all hate the Jews. They could have landed in France. They could have emptied off. They could have went to America. Many of them had the passports ready to go. It was Ben-Gurion, not England, that turned against God's chosen people. So they use lies, and they zealously try to affect you. It was during this time that Christian Zionism was established. And it was established on this idea that, oh, you have all these anti-Semites that hate Jews all over the world. Listen, guys, it's a big shell game. It's a big con game using sympathy. Using sympathy. So we look at back to Galatians 4:17. We look at 4:17. They zealously affect you. They're going to work day and night to get you to feel sorry for them, but not for well, not for good. The Bible doesn't say go into all the world and kill your neighbors and steal their property. The Bible doesn't say go into all the world and kill 15 to 16,000 people. The Bible doesn't say go into all the world and bomb hospitals and churches. You say, well, what about Hamas? Listen, they were doing this stuff long before Hamas was organized in the 1980s. Israel started out, there were over 30 slaughters that Israel did before 1948, unprovoked. There were 30 times that they went into cities and they threw hand grenades into houses and killed men, women, and children. They were committing terrorist acts. Menachem Begin, the head of the Irgun, they were bombing King David Hotel. They were doing the Lavon affair. They were dressing up like Arabs, blowing things up, killing their own Jewish people, killing people from England, killing Americans, and they were trying to do it to say, look, these Arabs are the terrorists. No. Israel was formed on terror. Menachem Begin said it himself. He was the man who helped himself wire the King David Hotel. Menachem Begin later became the Prime Minister of Israel. And he was asked, how does it feel to be the one who brought terrorism to the Middle East? He said, to the Middle East, he said, we brought it to the world. And so Israel was formed in the 1930s, even before 1948. Like I said, 33 major, massive expulsions of Palestinians and slaughter, pulling Palestinians out of their homes, shooting them in the back of the head, taking over their houses, stealing their houses. Where did Jesus ever say go into all the world, steal your neighbor's house and blow up people? Where does he say shed blood by the thousands? They zealously affect you, but not for good. Why don't we get back to preaching Jesus Christ and how that he didn't live for himself, but he gave his life for everyone in the world. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Why don't we go back to watching some of the shows, if you want to watch shows that show the passion of Christ, and begin to think about how that Jesus gave himself and shed his blood for other people, and not just for one race, but he loved the whole world. Why don't we put our affections back where they belong and stop following this concocted Christian Zionism thing that came from the minds of people who hate Jesus Christ. Stop waving their flags on your lapels, Pastor. Stop preaching your sermons. Stop hating all of us and be, I'm like the Apostle Paul. Apostle Paul said in chapter 4:16, am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? And I ask all these pastors, and I have been in court before. I've had pastors take me to court and try to shut down our girls' home because they said I'm a bad influence. Because they say he's anti-Semitic. I've had their lawyers say, Brother Woods is anti-Semitic. Brother Woods doesn't stand for Israel. He needs to shut down his church ministries, which reach out in love, and we've taken in people from all over. But we need to close that down. I'm sorry if I don't follow your cult, preachers. I'm sorry if I don't follow your cult that was founded by people who deny Jesus Christ and hate him. I'm sorry if I don't follow your cult, but I'm not going to become a part of Christian Zionism. I'm not a part of Zionist dispensationalism. I'm not part of any of that stuff anymore. And so it says, am I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? And I ask you, preachers, am I really become the enemy? Because I am telling you 100% truth. And you can like it, or you can lump it. I love Jesus Christ and his church. You go ahead and love all those people over there that have spent 75 years killing and hating their neighbors. I love my neighbor. We started a girls' home. We took in a lot of young ladies with all kinds of sins and all kinds of problems. We still reach out to people everywhere because I'm thinking about Jesus Christ who died on the cross. That's where my affections are. These other people have stolen your affections away into a cult.